I'm going to give everybody just a few seconds to get logged on, and then we will get started. Awesome. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the May RDLA webinar. We have some really great speakers for you today, but before we get started, I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping items. If you prefer to call into today's webinar, you can do so using this phone number here on the screen. It's 301-715-8592. If you would like to ask a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and a member of the RDLA team will direct your question to the speakers. Please be sure you're putting your questions into the Q&A box so that we see them. And a reminder for any media that's joining us, we ask that you formally announce your participation and refrain from quoting any of the discussion during the webinar. We encourage you to follow up with participants afterwards for direct quotes. We also offer closed captioning on all of our webinars. It is now available for you. All you need to do is click the live transcript button at the bottom of your window and the transcription will begin. We also have Spanish translation services available. Shannon sent a link in the chat. All you have to do is click that link and you will have access to that translation. So our agenda for today, we are going to start with Priscilla Rodriguez from the Every Life Foundation. She is going to give you all an overview of current clinical diversity bills in Congress. We then have Becky Abbott from the National Foundation for Ectodermal Dysplasia giving an update on the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act. We have Jamie Sullivan from the Every Life Foundation giving an update on the PDUFA process and that impact on the rare disease community. And then last but not least, we have Stephen Schultz from the Arthritis Foundation giving an update on state and federal copay accumulator legislation. So Priscilla, I will go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you everybody for being here. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. As Caitlin mentioned, I will be discussing the clinical trial diversity bills in Congress. Go to the next slide. So on the agenda today, we'll be discussing the Diversifying Investigations via Equitable Research Studies for Everyone, known as the Diverse Trials Act, the Diversity and Equitable Participation in Clinical Trials, known as the DEPICT Act, the Health Equity and Accountability Act of 2022, and we'll end with a comparison of the three bills. Next slide. Thank you. All right, so we're gonna hop into the Diverse Trials Act. That was introduced on August 10th, 2021 in the Senate by Senator Robert Menendez, and on August 13th, 2021 in the House by Representative Raul Ruiz. And the purpose of this bill is to increase clinical trial diversity and improve data collection for COVID-19 and other public health emergencies as it relates to social determinants of health. So in this bill, the HHS Secretary is to issue guidance on how to conduct decentralized clinical trials. They're also to create international harmonization on the regulations of DCTs and the use of digital health technologies or remote assessment options. Drug or device manufacturers are required to provide free provisions of digital health technologies to their clinical trial participants. A laboratory report is required, and that report is to include 1, how to improve current COVID-19 data collection activities, and 2, how to advance policies to address social determinants of health and collection of race and ethnicity in clinical trials. Remuneration can be offered to promote participation in the approved clinical trials, so long as it is registered and facilitates equitable inclusion of participants. And the Secretary will engage to design a national interoperable platform, and that interoperable platform will be used to improve access to health data and other relevant data needs during public health emergencies, such like COVID-19. Next slide. All right, the second bill we're going to take a look at is the DEPICT Act, which was introduced on February 3rd, 2022 in the House by Representative Anna Eshoo. And the purpose of this bill is to direct the Commissioner of the FDA to amend regulations to increase clinical trial diversity. So it discusses investigational use of drugs, and sponsors are required to include in their trials applications regarding demographic subgroup disease and or condition prevalence. For devices, similar, they're required to include in their clinical trial application demographic subgroups expected to use their device. There is an annual report that is required that justifies why enrollment targets weren't met. The application submitted should include enrollment targets, rationale for those enrollment targets, as well as a diversity action plan. Safety and effectiveness data for the drug is required for subgroups if the clinical trial did not meet enrollment targets. An additional report is needed that is discussing the progress on increasing diversity in clinical trial and study enrollment, and that report must be submitted annually. Lastly, the Secretary of HHS is to award grants and enter into cooperative agreements with qualified entities to increase participation in clinical trials and/or research. Next slide. Thank you. The third bill we'll be taking a look at is the Health Equity and Accountability Act of 2022. This was recently introduced on April 26, 2022 in the House by Representative Robin Kelly. The purpose of this act is to improve health for minority individuals and for other purposes. So racial and ethnic disparity in safety or effectiveness of a drug or product is to be investigated for pre-approval studies. For post-market studies, the Secretary may require investigation if there is evidence of racial or ethnic disparity in the safety or effectiveness of a drug or product. The Director of NIH should also work with the Director of the National Institute of Minority Health to improve the number of minority participants as study subjects in kidney disease clinical trials. So that is specifically for kidney disease clinical trials only. The FDA Commissioner shall aggregate information and accumulate the experiences of sponsors who develop and execute clinical trial diversity plans during drug development, and they'll use that information to determine what worked and what didn't work to enhance clinical trial diversity. Included in this bill as well is the Diverse Trials Act, which I recently covered. And some of you may have heard of the Clinical Trial Diversity Act, which was never introduced. However, it was subsumed into the Health Equity and Accountability Act. And the purpose of that bill is to direct the Secretary of HHS to take steps to increase clinical trial diversity. Next slide. So there are similarities and differences between the three bills. As you can see, each bill discusses utilizing decentralized clinical trials. It talks about the Secretary awarding grants and/or entering cooperative agreements, reporting and planning on the collection of race and ethnicity, and engaging with external entities to increase diverse participation in clinical trials. The Diverse Trials Act and Health Equity Act both discuss creating international harmonization and remuneration, so providing participants funding during clinical trials. And the DEPICT Act and Health Equity Act both require the sponsor to submit an annual report discussing enrollment targets. As of now, the Diverse Trials Act has 1 House co-sponsor and 5 Senate co-sponsors. The DEPICT Act has 10 co-sponsors, 1 Republican, 9 Democrats, and the Health Equity and Accountability Act have 59 co-sponsors, all Democrats. We're continuing to monitor these 3 diversity bills. We open feedback from anyone on this call. If you have any questions following this call, you can reach me at my email, p.rodriguez@everylifefoundation.org. Thank you.
Awesome, Priscilla, thank you so much. I don't see any questions just yet, but if any come up, I will direct them to you. Awesome, so we will go ahead and move over to Becky. Becky, I'll go ahead and turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Caitlin, and thank you everybody for joining today and allowing me to speak. So my name is Becky Abbott, and I am the manager or the Director of Treatment and Research Advocacy for the National Foundation for Ectodermal Dysplasias, and my son Aiden is also affected by ectodermal dysplasias. Next. So today we're going to be talking about advocating for the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act. I'm just going to give a brief introduction. This is my family. My sons are Lachlan, Ryder, and Aiden, who I'd mentioned is affected by X-linked hypohidrotic ectodermal dysplasias. We're from Slinger, Wisconsin, and we started our advocacy journey after many years of health insurance coverage struggles for the repair of my son's congenital anomaly. He's missing many of his teeth, and will need different surgeries throughout his lifetime, including bone grafting and dental implants. Aiden met with Senator Baldwin when he was around 10, 11 years old and inspired her to write and introduce the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act. So the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act, which is also known as ELSA, which is HR 1916 in the House and S754 in the Senate, is federal legislation that was reintroduced on March 16th of 2021 with strong bipartisan support. In the U.S. House of Representatives, we have 317 co-sponsors, and we're excited to announce that the bill passed in the U.S. House of Representatives on April 4th of this year with a 310 to 110 vote. We also have 40 co-sponsors in the U.S. Senate with a bipartisan split, so 20 Republicans and then 20 Democrat and 1 independent co-sponsors in the Senate. So the foundation of ELSA is that it's broadly written, basically based on the 50 state statutes that require insurers to offer coverages for medically necessary repair of all congenital anomalies. What ELSA will do is it will ensure that private, group, and individual health plans do not deny or delay medically necessary treatments of congenital anomalies. And then one important part of this legislation is it will take the medical necessity and it will take it out of the insurance company's hands and it will put it in the physician's hands to be determined by the treating physician. Next slide. These are our bill co-sponsors. The bill in the Senate is led by Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin and Senator Joni Ernst of Iowa. And then in the House, it is led by Representative Anna Eshoo from California and Representative Drew Ferguson from Georgia, who is a dentist. So what will ELSA do? About 4% of children are born with congenital anomalies in the United States. And as I had mentioned before, the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act will ensure that private, group, and individual health plans do not deny or delay medically necessary treatments of congenital anomalies. While the National Foundation for Ectodermal Dysplasia is advocating for this bill due to our families and loved ones being born with oral defects, such as missing teeth and enamel defects, ELSA covers all congenital anomalies as long as the treatments for those are medically necessary. So here are just a couple of different of those congenital anomalies. So I had mentioned oral defects such as cleft lip, cleft palate, hypodontia, and enamel defects. It will also cover skeletal defects, vision defects, particularly for babies who are born with congenital cataracts who need different lenses and surgeries to be able to see. It will also cover hearing defects, such as children who are born with missing ears or malformed ears who will need either bone anchored hearing devices or surgeries. The bottom line is that any medically diagnosed congenital anomaly that requires medically necessary treatment would benefit from the passage of the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act. And this is why we have over 70+ organizations that are supporting and advocating for ELSA. So I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I just wanted to add this slide that as everybody here knows, your story is powerful. Legislators want to hear stories from patients, from the patient's perspective, and you're the best person to share your story. We all have the opportunity to help change the lives of many individuals like us who live with congenital anomalies. However, we need to hear from all the different communities that represent the different congenital anomalies, and your legislators need to understand that this bill not only covers ectodermal dysplasias, but it covers the other congenital anomalies as well. So if your organization would benefit from this legislation, we ask that you reach out to your legislators and let them know how important this is to your community. Personal stories can help a legislator to decide to co-sponsor ELSA. Senator Baldwin, Senator Ernst, and many others that I could name have co-sponsored just because they've heard from one individual or one family who have advocated for this bill. As everybody here knows, each co-sponsor is important. And if legislators don't hear from you, they won't know how important ELSA is to your family or your patient community. I always like to mention anybody can advocate. It doesn't matter what age you are or if you've had previous experience. And I always like to ask, will you be the advocate who will make a difference in your state? Maybe not just for the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act, but for all of the different important legislation that is being discussed here today. So with the passage of the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act in the House, we are now trying to get the Help Committee and the Senate to take up the bill soon. So we're holding a NFD Virtual Date with the Senate on June 21st, 2022. It's open to all ELSA advocates and supporting organizations. So if you're interested in advocating for the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act, we would encourage you to sign on. The event is free, and the NFED schedules all virtual legislative meetings and with the Senate offices, so you don't have to do any of that work. Training is provided, and you do need to register by June 3rd. So I just want to ask if you had any questions at all. Otherwise, if we don't have any questions today, you can email me at becky@nfed.org. We also have a private Facebook group that you can find. It's called the Ensuring Lasting Smiles Act Advocates Group on Facebook, where we post updates and advocacy action items. And I just want to mention once again, our voices are always stronger together, and thank you for your support and for advocating for ELSA.
Becky, thank you so much for that presentation. We have one question for you. Someone is asking, what about people who are born with genetic conditions that lead to dental overcrowding, such as Ehlers-Danlos syndrome?
Yeah, so the two main things about this legislation is that one, it has to be a diagnosed congenital anomaly, so from birth. And then two, as long as the treatment for that congenital anomaly is medically necessary, determined by the treating physician, then it would be covered under this legislation.
Got it. Thank you so much, Becky. Continue to keep an eye on the chat. There's some more questions coming in there, so people may add a few more in for you.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. So we are now going to move to Jamie Sullivan.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. Hi, everyone. Glad to be with you again. You can advance the slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the status of the user fee agreements. You've heard us talk quite a bit about PDUFA, the prescription drug user fee agreement. Now we're just going to say user fee agreement, because what has come now out of the House in the recent weeks is a combination of several different user fee agreements for devices, generics, and biosimilars, as well as what we have talked about in the past and referred to as PDUFA. So you can go to the next slide. So before we get into highlights in what is in this draft of the user fee agreement, I thought it might be helpful to take a little bit of a step back and talk about what is PDUFA, just for those who may not be familiar. So PDUFA was first passed in 1992. It was a law that really supplemented the FDA with critical new resources by establishing user fees. Those fees are paid, they're agreed to in PDUFA, and then they are paid by biopharmaceutical companies, not taxpayers. This is not general revenue appropriations, given to the FDA. These are fees paid directly by companies to help support and enhance really the FDA's regulatory review infrastructure. They are paid based on the different categories laid out in the user fee agreement. And when applications are filed, there are certain requirements attached to that. So FDA sets target review timelines for completing a product review in PDUFA, and we often will hear that as the PDUFA date, including a 10-month for standard review and 6 months for priority review. And what happened as a result of PDUFA and establishing these new fees and infrastructure and commitments to timelines, we had the biggest surge in innovation ever in the 15-year period following PDUFA. We had 25 new therapies are approved, and it's continued to advance. The likelihood that a treatment is going to be approved in the US first. So that a lot of the progress in timelines and innovation has been directly a result of PDUFA coming into law in 1992. It is something that has to be reauthorized every 5 years. So here we are at the very end of a 5-year period. You can go to the next slide. And PDUFA often includes a number of different policy riders or other commitments related to regulatory reform. So how did we get here? FDA first invited non-industry stakeholders, including advocacy groups, healthcare professionals, or other experts to participate in meetings starting in July 2020. Through that period, through February 2021, we were, along with a number of you and our partner organizations, able to engage in monthly consultation meetings with the FDA. These happened alongside the actual PDUFA negotiations with regulated industry, with the pharma industry. That resulted in a draft commitment letter that was released in late August, which is really detailing a framework of policy commitments from the agency that have resulted in all of these conversations. Additional stakeholder feedback was sought in second public workshop, including testimony from the EveryLife Foundation and written comments just shortly thereafter. And then the FDA released a final commitment letter that was then transmitted to Congress in January, which really initiated the legislative process that we're in now, as members of Congress have to consider the policy priorities in front of them and pass a final user fee bill, ideally well before the September 30th deadline. There are some implications as we get closer and closer to that deadline. So PDUFA is one of, again, 4 user fee agreements that will be included in the final bill. Other agreements are for medical devices, generics, and biosimilars. Next slide. So what have we seen so far? We're really, I think, in the beginning of the middle of the process. So that we are certainly not at the finish line yet, but we have made significant progress in the last couple of weeks. The House Energy and Commerce Committee released their first draft of the bill on May 4th. And that's the first time we've seen gotten a look at what the priorities are for the committee members, and have kind of put a stake in the ground that we can then, the community can rally around and work with. So the 182 pages of legislative text, not light reading, really has policies, in addition to the user fees, policy commitments, focus on rare disease therapeutic development, accelerated approval, clinical trial diversity, much of which aligns with some of the things you heard Priscilla talk about earlier in this webinar. Some focus on decentralized trials and how do we encourage the further use of decentralized trials? What data do we need around real world evidence? How can we use real world evidence in decentralized trials, in confirmatory trials, and more? And then some other provisions around inspections and program reauthorizations. And we'll get into this a little bit more in the next slides. So just so important to note, we have, and I just realized I did not update this slide, but we have seen a very basic draft in the Senate, which we'll talk about a little bit later as well. We just saw that 2 days ago, but it's a very bare bones draft. So this is the most detailed we have. On the May 11th, the subcommittee marked up the bill, and the full E&C committee was able to mark up the bill yesterday. And a markup is just when members of the committee discuss the bill, offer amendments and changes, and then report out to the full House. So you can go on. So what are some of the highlights? These are text-heavy slides because it is not a light subject, but I'm going to go over some of the highlights and then welcome questions, and then these will be available for you to go back and read through, because simply just can't cover all of it in this webinar. So of course, there's a significant focus in the House bill on rare disease, and one of the ways that user fee bills tend to shape policy is by calling for the FDA and agencies like the GAO to conduct studies, hold workshops and public conversations on particular topics. And the draft bill includes several of those requirements that will end up resulting in reports to Congress or new guidances coming from the agency based on whatever those studies or meetings find. And so one of the areas that they focused on in the user fee draft is summarizing FDA's activity on rare diseases, with a focus on some of the metrics, the process metrics, numbers of applications, approvals, rejections. What are the trends over time in those approvals? And then really what you see throughout some of the rare disease provisions is a focus on understanding more about how FDA consults with external stakeholders. Some of this language is pulled from the HART Act. It's a bill that many of you are familiar with. It includes, reports summarizing efforts on how they're promoting best practices in reviewer training across the agency, regulatory science support for patient and stakeholder engagement, and more. It also includes a study to look at EU models for rare drug evaluation and how they apply flexibilities and what authorities they use and mechanisms for review. It also includes assessing how we collaborate across with the EU and how the EU consults with patients and other patient groups. So what can we learn from that, along with a GAO study then, and then an FDA report with recommendations on how patient and physician perspectives are being considered and incorporated into the regulatory process. That's a key part that we really want to focus on, not just how they're being considered, but how they're being used in the actual regulatory process. And it does include topics on internal benefit risk assessments and advisory committee processes, and post-approval safety monitoring. And it does include a public meeting with a report and recommendations on how can the FDA increase and improve engagement with rare disease patients, patient groups, condition experts, and experts on small population studies. That's another thing we wanted to highlight is there are several instances where small population studies are called out in particular, and that really aligns with some of the focuses in some of the other rare disease priorities that have moved forward around unique considerations with the ultra rare community. So you can go to the next slide. So what else does the user fee bill include? The user fee bill is also a mechanism or vehicle to create new programs or authorities and to reauthorize existing programs. So one of those programs that has to be reauthorized every 5 years is the Orphan Drug Grant Program, which provides critical funding right now for natural history studies and clinical trials in rare disease. And we're particularly happy to see that grant program expanded in scope and pulling from the STAT Act actually, and authorizing that program to develop and fund opportunities that are in regulatory science challenges. And that was, I think the language here, developing regulatory science pertaining to the chemistry, manufacturing, regulatory approval of, and controls of individualized medical products to treat people with rare diseases or conditions. So again, building on that ultra rare focus and allowing the grant program to be used to solve some of the toughest regulatory science challenges that are out there. It does create a new program really relevant to the rare disease community, establishing the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Pilot, which will establish procedures to provide increased interaction with sponsors of rare drugs. It does have less detail than what we originally saw in the commitment letter, but it does authorize up to 3 public meetings. Requires FDA to set up the processes for how they're going to create and evaluate, collaboratively create and work on rare disease endpoints, and then results in a guidance on further instruction to develop rare endpoints moving forward and reports to Congress on what happened as a result of this pilot. We're particularly encouraged and hope that the commitment to this program continues to grow because the challenges in establishing rare disease endpoints have been identified in numerous conversations as one of the biggest barriers to bringing forth rare disease therapeutics in a number of challenging conditions. So we hope to see this grow and expand over time. And then it does include a number of provisions that clarify FDA's authorities and really how they implement the law that they are charged with implementing. So one of those is based on giving exclusivity rights to rare disease treatments. This is a very meaty topic that we could spend a bunch of time on. So, I'll leave it at that, but we will dive into this more, in the near future. I can go to the next slide. So another theme coming from the user fee agreement, it has a provision that establishes a criteria for sponsors to share information with payers prior to approval. So it's acknowledging something that's also acknowledged in the STAT Act, which is the importance of earlier communication and engagement with payers. We know that rare disease patients often face delays in accessing a treatment after it's been approved because payers take more time to review the data. The endpoints that are used, the evidence that is used is often new to a payer. And for better or worse, they take longer to review that data. They have less understanding of it, and they're less robust information to use to determine coverage policies. So the user fee bill does not go as far as we've proposed in the STAT Act. However, it does offer a valuable channel for sponsors to communicate information prior to approval, which is not happening now. So that is an important enhancement of what's happening, what we can do now. It addresses the transparency of those communications, types of information that can be shared, and more, and then requires a GAO study at the end of the 5 years to figure out how that information was used so we can tweak and adjust moving forward. Next slide. So the user fee bill in the House also deals with accelerated approval reforms. And just as a reminder, accelerated approval pathway allows the FDA to use a surrogate endpoint to evaluate the safety and efficacy of therapies for serious conditions with unmet needs, including in rare disease. And that by evaluating that surrogate endpoint that is deemed to be reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit, the accelerated approval pathway helps patients get access to treatments at the earliest possible moment, while additional confirmatory studies continue to confirm that that expected clinical benefit was indeed realized. Accelerated approval is very important to the rare disease community. It was a significant focus during Rare Disease Week and the Legislative Conference and our caucus briefing. We continue to engage robustly on accelerated approval proposals. What is in the user fee bill is a really, I think, focused on tightening requirements on the sort of downstream changes. Permits the secretary to require confirmatory studies begin prior to approval, has some provisions related to more transparency in reporting, more frequent reporting, changes slightly the process for how a drug would be withdrawn from the market if confirmatory trials were not completed or didn't show the benefit that they expected. Has some concerning provisions related to changes to the labels for therapies that have used the accelerated approval pathway. And then again, requires some more frequent reporting. There are some more upstream focus, meaning making sure we can also solve the barriers that the rare disease community faces. This is an area where we can do much better in, and we will be putting forth a number of suggestions for ways to improve those upstream policy proposals. But what is in the user fee agreement does allow for real world evidence to augment or support post-approval studies and requires a report on how that evidence was considered, and requires some guidances on answering endpoint questions in early stage development, using novel trial designs, and using that expedited withdrawal procedures. This is more of an overview of what's in there. We are actively working on putting out, tweaks and working and engaging with the committees to identify improvements that can help better serve the rare disease community. But this gives you an idea of what our starting point is. Next slide. I just got a couple more here. Clinical trial diversity, you heard about already today, and the House bill does include new policy that will aim to help improve the diversity of clinical trial participants so that ultimately we can help ensure the evidence that is developed in a population that more accurately reflects the real world populations that be using the treatments. So the language in the user fee bill includes language pulled from DEPIC that would require the sponsor to submit diversity action plans, requires the FDA to release guidance detailing the requirements for those plans, which in part they have done recently, and requires public workshops, guidances, and an annual report. And I think it was important to point out that it does allow the secretary to waive requirements for that action plan based on what's known about the disease in the patient population that would be using that drug. And so we want to fully support any efforts to increase clinical trial diversity. We also want to make sure that those requirements are reflective of the populations that might be using the drug and reflective of the unique considerations in rare diseases. So next slide. So real world evidence in decentralized trials. You may have heard us talk about real world evidence in the past and about decentralized trials, which have become even more common in the COVID-19 world, where we know that many trial activities might take place outside of the original clinical site. And that has been a major benefit to continuing clinical research and getting a more accurate view, in some cases, of real-time monitoring what's occurring at home and other ways that decentralized trials have improved the research experience for many with rare diseases. So the user fee agreement has provisions that require guidance or updates to guidance on how how real world evidence and real world data could be used to support regulatory decision making. It's really advancing from understanding what it is, piloting a number of different programs, and now really trying to get to the heart of what do we need to consider as we think about actually using this real world evidence in regulatory submissions. It requires a support to Congress in 2 years on what submissions are including real world evidence and more. Decentralized trials, we have a public meeting to discuss how clinical trial flexibilities during the pandemic were used and what their impact was, especially as it relates to the impact on increasing clinical trial diversity in other populations, such as rural populations that maybe had less access to clinical trials in the past. Next slide. Oh, I think go one more. Go back one, sorry. So you may have heard us talk during Rare Disease Week about the role of PDUFA as a vehicle for other legislative priorities. Indeed, that is usually the case. And it is the case to some degree in this user fee agreement in the House. However, it is a must-pass piece of legislation. And that can mean it becomes a vehicle for advancing other policies that communities have been working on in the years between reauthorizations. It can also mean that because it's a must-pass vehicle, that some things get left off, that there may not be more consensus on. And so in this case, unfortunately, the draft in the House and even more so in the Senate does not include a number of policies that the rare disease community cares about and was hoping to see included in the user fee agreement. That does not mean it won't in the end. Certainly, we are not going to stop advocating. I wanted to highlight these two because we included them in the Rare Disease Week asked. The creation of a Rare Disease Center of Excellence and Rare Disease and Condition Advisory Committee, as called for in STAT, was not included in the user fee agreement. And indeed, the provisions that would strengthen the consideration of patient and caregiver experience data and product reviews as called for in the Benefit Act was also not included. In addition, there's generally not a lot of patient-focused drug development related provisions included in this draft of the user fee. There are highlights and themes pulled, even a piece from the STAT Act that is pulled as it relates to the Orphan Drug Grant Program expansion. We see a lot of, from what I've just covered, you can see a lot of the themes and sort of the important provisions that will help advance the rare disease community. And we hope that we can work with the committee to continue to build on that. We're working and we're in the middle of that process, and we're certainly not going to stop. Next slide. And this is my last slide, just kind of giving you a sense of what's next. Again, there's several steps left to get to the finish line, which means there will be several opportunities for the rare disease community to make your voices heard. I will say that we're just in the, like I said, the beginning of the middle of the process right now. So while we don't have a direct call to action for you now today, I would really encourage you to stay tuned and to stay in touch with RDLA. Make sure you get the RDLA action alerts so that when there is the right time, we are going to send out action alerts, up to email updates, and make sure that the community knows when your voice will be most effective on a number of important priorities. So again, the full committee markup was held yesterday, likely a bit of a waiting game now. And in the Senate, the discussion draft was released, which is basically a step before the draft bill. And they are accepting comments till the 22nd. And then we'll proceed to mark up the bill with the Senate Help Committee, likely in late May or early June. And then it's a bit of I put a question mark word cloud because it's a bit of a unknown that we will see what happens from there, whether there's an informal conference, whether the House votes out their bill or waits for the Senate. So truly it is a wait and see game in how the process plays out, but we are staying engaged and we will keep you informed and engaged along the way. So that's it for me. Thank you for listening to all of that meaty detail.
No, Jamie, that was awesome. Thank you so much. We have a few questions for you. So one is, what are you hearing about the Senate Help Committee, maybe including accelerated approval in their user fee package? This person says, I know they did not include it in the draft, but going forward, what do you think they may do?
Yeah, so the Senate draft that was released is pretty bare of a number of policy writers. So from what we understand, they released a discussion draft with what had been agreed to thus far, but conversations are still underway. That's why they're accepting comments, and they are still working out some of the trickier issues like accelerated approval. It's not a guarantee that it will be included and added in, but I know that we are certainly not giving up that advocacy, and I know that there's still committee members working on trying to come to an agreement on what can indeed move forward with the bill.
Thank you. And then someone is asking if you think there will be complications from the PDUFA ad that was in the Hill this week, seeking that sections are removed from the bill. And if so, what do you think the answer to this concern is?
I'm not sure which particular ad they are referring to. Not something I've seen yet, but certainly there will be advocacy on a number of different issues, seeking to remove different pieces, no matter what, from different groups. I think the House is pretty far along in their process. I think there's opportunities still to engage on what comes out in the final bill, and certainly engage in what ends up in the Senate bill. But yes, there's going to be a number of advocacy efforts to both remove and shape current provisions. So I will look up that ad that they're talking about, both without knowing the exact issue. I'm not sure.
Got it. Thank you so much, Jamie. And we have one more speaker for you. Last but not least, we have Stephen Schultz from the Arthritis Foundation.
No, thank you very much. Very honored to be with this group of presenters talking about so many important issues. My name is Stephen Schultz. I'm the Director of State Legislative Affairs, and I'll talk about accumulator adjustment programs and some of the activity that's going on the state level that I work on, but also the federal level, and give you an idea of what's happening there. And so just for, I know I was just looking at the attendee list, a lot of great folks that, friends, colleagues that I've worked with on this issue, but don't want to assume anything as far as knowledge base. You could be walking in here and never heard of an accumulator adjustment program, and that is perfectly understandable. It's a relatively new addition to insurance barriers, PBM barriers that have been put in place just over the last couple of years. So accumulator adjustment programs, as many of you may know, chronic disease patients, rare disease patients, use copay assistance to be able to pay for their life-saving medications. Copay accumulator programs have been a recent addition to kind of counteract that. And what they do is prevent that assistance from counting towards the patient's cost sharing. So their deductible annual out-of-pocket cost maximum. So the patient will pay like they've maybe done for years while using their copay assistance. And what the Accumulation Adjustment Program will do is kind of suck those funds out without counting it, so that the funds will eventually be exhausted without any benefit to the patient. And then the patient, about halfway through the plan year, will go to the pharmacy counter or go to pay their bill for their medication and find out, oh, I'm on the hook. My assistance has not been counting, and I have to figure out what to do. And some patients have to make tough calls as far as adherence to their medication, maybe finding a different medication. Usually patients have gone through prior authorization, step therapy, other utilization management tools to get on those medications. Maybe have tried generic equivalents or any other lower cost alternatives to their medications. So this is very troublesome, and something that we're seeing definitely grow, not only on the ERISA market, but on the state exchange plans. And next slide, we'll talk a little bit about kind of what the landscape of the state exchange plans look like here. A great partner in this fight against accumulation program has been the AIDS Institute, that showcases kind of great landscape of the state exchange market, that showcases 35 states have at least one plan with an accumulation adjustment program. 8 states where every single plan has an accumulation adjustment program. So even if you're an educated patient that's done their homework, knows, I know about accumulation adjustment program, I'm going to do everything to avoid it. In any of those states, every single plan has one. So there's really no way to avoid an accumulation adjustment program in that state if you're kind of taking advantage of the state exchange plan. And then 30 states were at least half. So even if you were educated, but you did all that formulary homework to find out, hey, this plan covers my medication. This is the one I want to pick. And then all of a sudden you find out, oh, they have an accumulation adjustment program. And so this definitely creates a big issue, especially when that's partnered with just kind of continued data, the fact that so many patients would struggle without having access to these assistance programs to be able to afford their medications. And one of the last elements of just kind of setting the pace, setting the tone as far as kind of what these programs are, is that I like to show kind of just an example of what this may look like in the plan document. And here's one from, again, for the Institute, it showcased kind of what an Ohio plan looked like. And really kind of, you'll see legalese language. I think if you read it, even if you see some of these kind of health policy folks on the line today, some of them may make out what's going on here, but maybe the average patient it may read through it and understand it, but it's just not very kind of clear as far as what it's getting at. And then it's also usually tucked away into the plan documents. And so what are we doing about it? You may have heard, if you've heard about this issue, All Copays Count, or All Copays Count Coalition. And it's a great coalition, which is diverse in the type of groups working on this issue to really combat it. And we have kind of state subgroups, federal subgroups working on this issue. But all it does, all our language does, as far as our state bills do, it's just ensures that payments paid by the patient or on behalf of the patient should count towards the patient's cost sharing. It's usually one of the shortest bills that a legislator is going to read all year. And so it just gets to the point that third-party payments should be counting just like the patient is paying it. Endorsed by many great groups. But the next slide will go through kind of what the landscape's looking like with state activity. I mentioned that this relatively new issue, and you'll see the gold states there that articulate that those have been enacted, and those have just been enacted since 2019. So a lot of successes just in a very short period of time, just to ensure that all copays count. This year alone, we've had 2 victories so far on opposite ends of the coast, one in Washington and one most recently in Maine, where that bill it was enacted without the governor's signature. We still have a couple other states on the board here left to go. A lot of these states that are in green that were active this year. Even years tend to be kind of the quicker years. They tend to focus on budgets and get out and focus on re-election. So there's some of these states that you'll see that we have noted as the 2022 campaigns may already be kind of finished for the year. They may have exhausted all the time that they had left for the year. The bill may not have made it, but most of these states that are in that kind of boat will be back in 2023. There's already planning for some of these states that are in that boat. There are a few states that are in a camp that they may be going throughout the summer, maybe going into the fall, maybe even have parts of their session that will be back after the elections in the fall. So there's still some time for some of these states to get over the finish line. I think one of the biggest the possibilities for success is probably New York. New York has just passed the assembly by an overwhelming amount. I don't think it received a no vote, and that was just yesterday. So a lot of momentum with that. It will have to also pass the Senate. And there's only a few days left of kind of actual meeting days to get over the finish line. So they're doing a lot of pushes. You may see that as a New York advocate. Some of the kind of the social media around that effort, some of the pushes, and anything you can do to help over that, to get that bill over the finish line will definitely be helpful. But that one is got some momentum going. There's a few of these states that have passed one chamber already, like a Michigan or an Ohio, or ones that are close to getting over that first chamber hump, like Delaware, which is on the Senate floor today. And hopefully that will move fast and we'll see a victory in Delaware. So a lot of activity. And the last thing I'll say on kind of state activity is that you'll see kind of a lot of gray in that West states. And that's just because as someone that's more partial to the West states being in California, is that some of these states are out of session this year. So you got like a state like Texas, Nevada, Montana, all out of session this year, or tend to be quicker sessions, like I'll say an Oregon, which had an accumulated adjustment program bill last year, but took a pause this year and said, hey, we have a quick budget session. Let's focus on getting everything right for an odd session next year. So you'll see, I think, in this odd session next year, an even more kind of overwhelming number of introductions and work on this, and probably another banner year, in addition to the work we still have left to do in 2022. So federal legislation, a lot of that state activity has led to federal legislation, and the Help Copays Act, HR 5801. And I think for folks that work in health policy, have been an advocate in health policy, very familiar with a lot of the work that we do takes a federal fix and a state fix. And this is no different that our state exchange plans, there's a great Avalier study that came out just recently that showed kind of the state impact that these bills have. And it's no surprise that it's a little bit minimal compared to what we can accomplish through the ERISA market, or a large employer market that a federal bill could impact. And that's where this federal bill comes into play. Federal legislation takes time. And this is the first year that we've got a bill introduced. Already have 36 sponsors, 32 Democrats, 4 Republicans. So definitely looking to create a more bipartisan bill as we move forward in Congress. And we have a number of groups that are doing Hill Days and advocacy on this, and that will only continue to grow just since this is not only such a new topic, but a very, very new topic to Congress. And there's kind of an element of building momentum between each other as far as federal and state. The more state victories that we have, federal legislation will continue to grow. The more co-sponsors and momentum we get on the federal level, it's only going to signal the states to continue that momentum to go. The federal legislation is a little bit different than the state bills. It has 2 elements of it. It has the accumulator ban, the same type of language that the state bills have, but then it also has a central health benefit loophole fix. Some of you may be familiar with programs called Save on SP or those types of programs. And the way they work is removing a category of prescription drugs from being called essential and covered as essential. So they're able to remove that as an essential health benefit and kind of put you on a different type of program and not cover the prescription drug and do an accumulator or maximizer or whatever they want to call it that way. So this bill kind of combats what health plans and PBMs are doing in both fashions, as far as ensuring that assistance is counted, but then also ensuring that they have to cover these prescription drugs as essential. So definitely excited that that this bill has been introduced and will only help the momentum on this issue and the discussion on this issue. And then my last slide, kind of ways that you can help. I mentioned kind of that 2022, 2023 for state sessions and federal will just be super crucial, and advocating, discussing and educating your members of Congress and working with groups to really push this forward. It's just going to be so crucial for the next couple of sessions. And bubble up those stories. Patient stories are just going to be so crucial to moving the needle on this. If you have, even if it's something where you have a story of how assistance is crucial to you being adhered on your medication, that's still a very viable and still very compelling story to be able to share with elected officials and something that they need to hear. So it's, even if it's a case where you haven't run across this human adjustment program or you've been kind of savvy enough to try to avoid it, it's still very important to share that type of story as well. And keeping that for further escalation. I mentioned kind of maximizers or optimizers, Save on SP, those types of programs. Keep an eye on that. I think as we've done more victories in this space on accumulator adjustment programs, there's been kind of tweaks or escalations from the health plans and PBMs on this topic. So it's not something they're going to go quietly on. So we're going to continue to push and combat. The good thing about our language and what we're doing is that it's pretty broad. It's combating and just ensuring that, hey, if you've got funds that are going to you, you should be counting them, whether it's the patient or a third party. And then the last thing I'll say is employee education is just so crucial. I mentioned that the ERISA market is kind of the biggest element of creating change on this subject. And we'll push and push for federal legislation and fixes that can come from the administration possibly. But doing education to your employer, educating them about these types of programs, saying, hey, if you can avoid this, or if this is not going to cause that much of a premium change to our organization or company, can we make sure that we're offering plans that don't have an accumulator adjustment program, and talking about kind of some of the negative consequences that they can have. Because if employers are pushing back and saying, hey, we don't want these, then that will only help with kind of the offerings or the amounts they are. And sometimes they're not even aware that they are offering them to their patients. They're not digging that much in, or it's being hidden, like I mentioned. At the very top, I often share that kind of the Arthritis Foundation, we had an accumulator adjustment program in our plans that we were offering to our employees as an organization, while also working to combat it legislatively and educationally. It was something that slipped through our fingers. So that just stresses the importance of that employer education while we're also working on this legislative and regulatory fix for it. But no, thank you very much for having me on. Happy to answer any questions that folks might have about anything that I mentioned.
Stephen, thank you so much. That was such a great presentation. It doesn't look like we have any questions right now, but definitely continue to keep an eye on the chat. Some may pop in there. I have just a few reminders to everyone before we end. Rare Across America registration is now open. If you haven't participated with us before, Rare Across America is the opportunity to meet with your members of Congress at their in-district offices. Each member of Congress has an office in Washington, D.C., as well as an office or multiple offices in their respective districts and states. Rare Across America is a really great opportunity to educate your member of Congress on the issues that are most important to the rare disease community. So meetings this year will be between August 8th and 19th. Meetings are scheduled based on each advocate's availability. Whenever you register, you will be asked what days you are not available, and we will schedule your meetings around that. Senate meetings will be virtual. We will not be doing any in-person Senate meetings. But what's really exciting is all of the House meetings will be in person. And this is the first time we have done in-person meetings for Rare Across America in quite some time. So that's very exciting. If you would like to join us for trainings, we have a few different options. On July 14th, we will be doing the Share Your Story with Policymakers webinar, where we will have some fantastic coaches come and give you all personalized advice on your rare disease story and how to best share your rare disease story to your policymaker. Then on July 19th, we will have our Rare Across America general training webinar, where we will cover everything you need to know for Rare Across America. And then lastly, on July 21st, we will have our team coordinator training webinar. So team coordinators are assigned to meetings with 5 or more people, and they are there to just help you all get organized and go into the meeting prepared. So we will hold a training for those team coordinators on July 21st. So if you are interested in learning more or registering to attend, you can go to www.rareacrossamerica.org, and you will find everything that you need there. If you have any questions about Rare Across America, you can also feel free to email me. My email will be on the very last slide here. Our next RDLA monthly webinar is going to be June 16th at noon, as always. If you would like to speak on this webinar, or if you have any particular topics that you're interested in hearing about for future webinars, please email me and let me know. We always love to hear your feedback. And then lastly, if you have not already, please sign up for our newsletter on our website. You can also fill out action alerts, which are just messages that go to your members of Congress. You can also do that on our website. And then we also encourage you to follow us on social media to keep up with everything that is going on. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out. My email address is here, as well as Shannon's and our state advocacy fellow, Rachel. And then lastly, a thank you to our May RDLA webinar sponsors. And thank you all for being here. Thank you to all of our panelists. We appreciate you all for joining us. And we will see you all in June. Thanks, everyone.